The rain poured in relentless sheets, hammering against the windows of the sprawling Brimstone Manor. Thunder growled across the night sky, rattling the glass chandeliers that hung precariously from the vaulted ceilings. The air inside was heavy with tension, despite the warmth of the roaring fire in the grand living room. For all its grandeur, the house felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves held their breath. It was on this storm-ridden night that the call came to me. My name is Adrian Voss, a private investigator with 20 years of experience in chasing down secrets people would rather keep buried. When the voice on the other end of the line identified itself as Margaret Hathaway, a prominent lawyer for the illustrious Davenport family, I knew the stakes were high before she even explained. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice clipped and steady, "I'm afraid we're dealing with a tragedy. Thomas Davenport, the patriarch of the Davenport estate, has been found dead in his study. The family believes it to be an accident, but—" She hesitated, the pause speaking louder than her words ever could. "There are inconsistencies. A murder? Or just a family too steeped in wealth and paranoia to trust each other? Either way, I agreed to take the case. Within hours, I found myself driving through torrential rain to reach Brimstone Manor, its towering silhouette illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning. The journey itself was foreboding. The winding road up the hillside flanked by skeletal trees, swaying in the wind. As I arrived, the butler, a gaunt man named Harris, greeted me with a stiff nod. He led me through the cavernous halls of the estate, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rugs lining the floors. Margaret Hathaway awaited me in the study, her sharp suit immaculate despite the chaos that seemed to envelop the house. "I appreciate your promptness," she said, her eyes scanning me with a mix of relief and scrutiny. "The police have already been through, but I'm convinced they've overlooked something. Thomas was a careful man. He didn't simply fall. The study was a grand room, its walls lined with towering bookshelves crammed with leather-bound tomes. A massive oak desk sat at the center, its surface meticulously organized except for the broken glass scattered across one side. The faint smell of spilled brandy lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of rain seeping into a cracked window. Thomas Davenport's body had been removed, but the scene remained telling. A toppled chair lay near the desk, and an ornate letter opener, its blade smeared with something dark, rested on the floor. My eyes caught the faint outline of a footprint near the desk, not large enough to belong to a man of Thomas's stature. "Who found the body?" I asked, turning to Margaret. "His wife, Eleanor," she replied. "She claimed she heard a commotion from the study and came to investigate. By the time she arrived, she trailed off, glancing toward the window as if seeking an answer in the storm outside. And Eleanor is—" Margaret's lips tightened, distraught as one would expect. "But you'll see for yourself." I did. Eleanor Davenport was a striking woman, her beauty undimmed by the grief etched across her face. She sat in the drawing room, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her posture was impeccable, her movements precise, yet there was an air of detachment about her, as if she were performing the role of the grieving widow rather than living it. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice soft yet deliberate, "I assume you're here to uncover the truth." "That's the idea," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "I'd like to start by hearing your account of what happened." She recounted the evening with an unsettling calm. She had been upstairs, tending to some personal affairs, when she heard the sound of breaking glass from the study. Rushing down, she found Thomas slumped over his desk, his head resting on a shattered glass. The police had ruled it an accidental fall, likely exacerbated by the brandy he had been drinking, but Eleanor's expression suggested she doubted that conclusion. "Did Thomas have any enemies?" I asked. Her lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "When you're as wealthy as Thomas was, everyone is an enemy in one way or another. But no, not directly. He was careful about such things. Careful." The word echoed Margaret's earlier description, and I began to wonder what exactly Thomas had been so careful about. Before I could press further, Harris entered the room, his expression grave. "Excuse me, madam," he said, addressing Eleanor. "The storm has caused some flooding in the basement. I thought you should be informed." "Flooding?" Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Very well. See to it." Harris nodded and left, but his interruption sparked something in my mind. The basement, a place rarely visited in such estates, might hold more than just water. "The flooding," I said, turning back to Eleanor. "Does your basement store anything significant?" Her hesitation was almost imperceptible. "Just old furniture and documents," she replied. "Nothing of interest." "I'd like to take a look," I said, standing. "With your permission, of course." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary, her expression unreadable. "As you wish," she said finally. As I descended the narrow staircase to the basement, the air grew colder, the dampness seeping through the stone walls. The flickering light of my flashlight revealed a cluttered space filled with cobweb-covered furniture and stacks of crates. In the corner, a metal filing cabinet stood slightly ajar, its contents spilling onto the floor. Among the scattered papers, I found something curious. A ledger detailing financial transactions that seemed unusual, payments to accounts with no names, only numbers. And among them, a single entry that caught my eye. Transferred HE $500,000. Before I could examine it further, a sound behind me froze me in place. The faint creak of a floorboard, followed by the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steady despite the chill creeping up my spine. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Whoever it was, they were gone before I could find them. But the ledger in my hands was enough to tell me one thing. This wasn't just an accident, and Eleanor Davenport wasn't telling me everything. The ledger from the basement burned in my mind as I returned to my temporary quarters in Brimstone Manor. The entry HE $500,000 stood out like a beacon, but its meaning remained shrouded. Who was HE? And why had Thomas Davenport transferred such a significant amount to them? The questions gnawed at me as I sifted through my notes, the rain still drumming against the windows. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving the grounds of the estate damp and eerily quiet. The sky remained overcast, casting a dull gray light over the manor. I decided to revisit Eleanor for more answers. Though her aloof demeanor left me doubtful I would get the truth. Eleanor greeted me in the conservatory, a sprawling glass enclosure filled with lush plants and the faint scent of citrus. She was seated at a wrought iron table, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. Her posture was as immaculate as ever, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Mr. Voss," she said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I trust you've made progress?" "That depends," I replied, taking the seat opposite her. "The ledger in your basement, it's an interesting find. Care to shed some light on the transactions it records?" For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. Her hand hesitated over her teacup before she set it down with deliberate care. "Thomas handled all financial matters," she said, her tone carefully measured. "I rarely involve myself, even when $500,000 is at stake." I pressed. Her gaze met mine, cold and unwavering. "Thomas had his secrets, Mr. Voss. I learned long ago not to question them." Secrets. The word lingered between us like a specter. I decided to change tactics. "The initials HE. Do they mean anything to you?" She hesitated again, a flicker of something. Fear? Recognition? Crossing her face before she masked it with indifference. "No," she said simply. "Should they?" Before I could press further, Margaret Hathaway appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice clipped. "There's someone here you need to meet." Margaret led me to the sitting room, where a man stood by the fireplace, his back turned to us. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark suit impeccably tailored. When he turned, his sharp features and piercing gray eyes immediately conveyed authority. Detective Harris, he introduced himself, extending a hand. Local law enforcement. I heard about your involvement in this case and thought we should compare notes. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip. I'm all ears, I said, though I couldn't shake the feeling that his visit was less about collaboration and more about keeping tabs on me. Harris wasted no time. Thomas Davenport's death has raised a few flags, he began. For one, the autopsy revealed traces of a sedative in his system. Enough to impair judgment but not lethal on its own. Coupled with the spilled brandy and the apparent fall, it's suspicious. Suspicious enough to rule out an accident, I asked. Harris's lips pressed into a thin line. Let's just say we're keeping our options open. As he spoke, my mind returned to the footprint I had seen near the desk, the faint creak of the floorboards in the basement. Someone had been there that night, and it wasn't just Eleanor. Did you find anything else? I asked. Harris nodded. There were inconsistencies in the timeline provided by Mrs. Davenport. She claimed she was upstairs when she heard the commotion, but the maid recalls seeing her near the study shortly before the incident. Eleanor's detached demeanor suddenly took on a more sinister shade. Was she lying to protect herself, or was there more to her story? After Harris left, I returned to the conservatory, where Eleanor was still seated, her tea untouched. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Davenport, I said, why didn't you mention that you were near the study before Thomas's death? Her eyes narrowed, a flash of anger breaking through her calm facade. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Voss? I'm implying that your account of that night is incomplete, I said evenly. And if you're withholding information, it's only going to raise more questions. She rose to her feet, her movements sharp and deliberate. You think I killed my husband? She demanded, her voice low but charged with emotion. That I staged this entire charade? I think, I said carefully, that you're hiding something. And until I know what it is, I can't rule anything out. Eleanor's composure cracked further. She turned away, her shoulders tense, and for a moment, I thought she might confess. But when she spoke, her voice was steady once more. You have no idea what you've walked into, Mr. Voss, she said, her tone icy. Be careful where you tread. This house has a way of swallowing those who dig too deep. Her words hung in the air long after she left the room. A chilling reminder that Brimstone Manor held more than just the secrets of Thomas Davenport's death. And as I stood there, piecing together the fragments of this tangled web, one thing became clear. The shadows beneath the surface were darker than I had imagined, and the answers I sought would come at a price. The sun had barely risen when I found myself standing in Brimstone Manor's vast library. The room, though grand and filled with ornate shelves, felt colder than the rest of the house. Rows of leather-bound books loomed over me like silent sentinels, their spines marked with gold lettering that glimmered faintly in the morning light. I wasn't there for literature. Somewhere amidst the knowledge and pretension, I hoped to find a thread that might unravel the tangled web around Thomas Davenport's death. Eleanor's words from the previous evening still lingered in my mind. Asterisk, you have no idea what you've walked into. Asterisk, they carried an air of warning, but also challenge. It was clear she knew more than she let on, and her careful demeanor was beginning to crack. Whether it was grief, guilt, or a combination of both, I intended to find out. Margaret Hathaway entered the library as I thumbed through an old ledger on one of the desks. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, her movements brisk and purposeful. She carried a thin manila folder in her hand, which she set down in front of me. I thought you want to see this, she said, her tone clipped. It's a copy of Thomas's correspondence from the last 6 months. I pulled it from his office. I opened the folder, revealing neatly organized photocopies of handwritten letters, typed memos, and email printouts. One in particular caught my attention, a letter addressed to someone identified only as H.E. H.E. again, I murmured, scanning the contents. The letter was brief, almost cryptic. H.E., Asterisk, I trust our arrangement will remain confidential. The transfer has been made. Expect further contact once my business here is resolved. Asterisk. Thomas Davenport. Do you recognize the handwriting? I asked, glancing at Margaret. Yes, she replied without hesitation. It's definitely Thomas's. Did he ever mention someone with these initials? Margaret shook her head. No, but Thomas was private, even with me. Her admission was interesting. For someone entrusted with managing the Davenport family's legal affairs, Margaret seemed to know far less than she should have. Or perhaps she was holding back. What about Eleanor? I asked. Did she know about this? Margaret hesitated. If she did, she never mentioned it. But Eleanor, she's not the type to meddle in Thomas's affairs. At least, not overtly. Not overtly. The phrase hung in the air like a specter. I closed the folder and rose to my feet. Thank you, Margaret. This might be exactly what I need. My next stop was the garden, a sprawling expanse of manicured hedges and overgrown corners that spoke of both wealth and neglect. Eleanor was there, standing by a stone fountain, her pale dress billowing slightly in the cool breeze. She turned as I approached, her expression unreadable. Mr. Voss, she said, I didn't expect to see you out here. A change of scenery does wonders for the mind, I replied, stopping a few feet away. I've been reviewing Thomas's correspondence. There's a name that keeps coming up. H.E., do you know who that might be? Her reaction was subtle but telling. A flicker of recognition passed through her eyes before she schooled her features into neutrality. No, she said, too quickly. I can't say I do. Can't or won't. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Eleanor, I pressed, lowering my voice, this is your chance to come clean. If you know anything about H.E. or why Thomas transferred $500,000 to them, now is the time to tell me. She turned away, her gaze fixed on the rippling water in the fountain. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Thomas had his secrets, Mr. Voss. More than you could imagine. But whatever he was involved in, I had no part of it. And yet you're here, caught in the middle of it, I said. If you're innocent, you need to help me prove it. She looked at me then, her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Regret? You're digging into things better left buried, she said. I hope you're prepared for what you might find. Back in the study, I pored over the ledger and the correspondence, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that refused to come together. The initials H.E., the mysterious transfer, the sedative in Thomas's system. They all pointed to something larger, something deliberate, but the connections remained elusive. It was then that Harris appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. We need to talk, he said. What is it? I asked, gesturing for him to sit. He held up a plastic evidence bag containing a small vial. We found this in the trash behind the manor. It's the same sedative that was in Davenport's system. Any fingerprints? Harris shook his head. Clean. Whoever handled it knew what they were doing. What about the maid? I asked. She said she saw Eleanor near the study before Thomas's death. Has she elaborated? Harris hesitated. She's changed her story. Claims she was mistaken about the timing. I frowned. Sounds like someone got to her. Harris nodded. That's my guess, too. But who and why? The question hung heavy in the air as I turned back to the desk. The deeper I delved into this case, the more it became clear that Thomas Davenport's death was no accident. But the truth remained shrouded, hidden in the whispers of deception that filled Brimstone Manor. As Harris left, I glanced at the ledger one last time. The initials H.E. stared back at me, taunting, elusive. Somewhere in this house, or perhaps beyond its walls, lay the key to unraveling the mystery, and I intended to find it. Brimstone Manor wore its secrets like a second skin, the air within its halls heavy with unspoken words and hidden intentions. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the estate, I prepared for another confrontation with Eleanor Davenport. She had grown increasingly elusive, retreating into a shroud of calculated indifference, but I wasn't about to let her slip away from my questions. The dining room was dimly lit, the flickering light of the chandelier casting eerie patterns on the mahogany table. Eleanor sat at the far end, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Voss," she said, her tone even, "have you uncovered anything of substance, or are you still chasing shadows?" "That depends," I replied, taking a seat opposite her. "Are you ready to stop hiding behind polite indifference and tell me what you know?" Her lips twitched in a faint smile. "I've told you everything relevant. If you find shadows, it's because you're looking in the wrong places." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "Your maid changed her story. She initially said she saw you near the study shortly before Thomas's death. Now she claims she was mistaken. Care to explain?" Eleanor's eyes flashed with something sharp, anger perhaps, or fear. "The staff are often unreliable witnesses," she said coolly. "I wouldn't put too much stock in their accounts." "Convenient," I said, holding her gaze, "but not convincing. You were near the study that night, weren't you?" Her silence was answer enough. She reached for the glass of wine in front of her, taking a slow sip before speaking. I heard raised voices. I went to see what was happening, but by the time I arrived, it was over. Thomas was slumped over his desk. I panicked. I didn't think, who was he arguing with? Her grip tightened on the glass. "I don't know. By the time I got there, the room was empty. And you didn't think to mention this to the police?" I asked, my tone sharp. Her expression hardened. "I've already told you, Mr. Voss." I panicked, and the police were more than willing to write it off as an accident. I didn't see the need to complicate things. I studied her for a moment, her carefully controlled demeanor fraying at the edges. There was truth in her words, but also omission. She was holding something back, something critical. Later that evening, I found myself back in the basement, drawn to the filing cabinet where I had first discovered the ledger. The space was colder than before, the damp stone walls amplifying every creak and whisper of the house above. I rummaged through the remaining papers, searching for anything that might shed light on Thomas's dealings with H. It was then that I found it, a faded photograph tucked between two folders. The image was black and white, depicting a younger Thomas standing beside a man I didn't recognize. Scrawled on the back were the words, "Harmon Ellery, May 1984. H.E. Harmon Ellery." The name sent a jolt through me. I flipped the photograph over again, scrutinizing the man beside Thomas. He had a sharp, fox-like face and a confident stance, his eyes gleaming with the kind of charm that often masks something darker. Armed with the photograph, I sought out Margaret Hathaway in her office. She was seated at her desk, poring over a stack of legal documents, but looked up as I entered. "You find something?" she asked, her tone brisk. I handed her the photograph. "Do you know who this is?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly as she examined the image. "Harmon Ellery," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "He was a business associate of Thomas's years ago. They parted ways under less than amicable circumstances." "Define less than amicable," I pressed. Margaret hesitated. Ellery accused Thomas of cutting him out of a lucrative deal. There were lawsuits, threats. It was messy. But as far as I know, Ellery disappeared shortly after. No one's heard from him in decades. "Until now," I said, more to myself than to her. Margaret frowned. "Do you think he's involved in this?" "It's possible," I said. "If Thomas was sending money to him, there's a reason, and I intend to find out what it is." That night, as the manor settled into uneasy silence, I found my thoughts returning to Eleanor, her reaction to the initials H.E., her evasiveness about the study, and now this connection to Harmon Ellery. The threads were beginning to weave a pattern, but it was one I couldn't yet decipher. I retired to my room, my mind restless. The photograph sat on the desk beside me, a tangible piece of the puzzle that was Thomas Davenport's death. As I stared at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, and for a moment, I thought I heard the faint creak of a floorboard outside my door. I stood and opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty, the silence oppressive, yet the sensation of being observed lingered, an invisible weight pressing against my chest. Brimstone Manor wasn't just a house. It was a labyrinth of secrets, and I was only beginning to understand how deep they ran. Sleep eluded me that night. The whispers of Brimstone Manor had grown louder, filling the empty corridors with an unshakable tension. Harmon Ellery's name repeated in my mind like a mantra, each syllable weighed down with decades of mystery. The photograph now felt like a key, a small but crucial piece of a larger, darker puzzle. At dawn, I ventured back to the study, determined to find more. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a thick mist that clung to the windows like a second skin. The desk, where Thomas Davenport had spent countless hours, stood as both a monument to his power and a silent witness to his demise. I began sifting through the drawers, finding nothing but neatly arranged papers, contracts, property deeds, business plans, all meticulously organized. And then, tucked in the back of a lower drawer, I found something that didn't belong, a leather-bound journal, its edges worn from use. The first few pages contained mundane entries about meetings and acquisitions, written in Thomas's neat hand. But as I flipped further, the tone shifted. The entries grew terse, almost frantic, as if they were written in a rush. Asterisk March 14th. H.E. contacted me again. He's demanding more, says he'll expose everything if I don't comply. I can't let this get out. The family, they'd never recover, asterisk. Asterisk March 25th. The money is gone. I've done what he asked, but I know it won't be enough. It's never enough, asterisk. Asterisk April 3rd. Eleanor suspects something. I see it in her eyes. I can't let her find out. She wouldn't understand. None of them would, asterisk. The entries stopped abruptly after that. I stared at the final page, the ink slightly smudged, as if Thomas's hand had trembled as he wrote. Harmon Ellery wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was a threat, one that had pushed Thomas to the brink. Margaret Hathaway found me in the study, her expression tight. She carried a newspaper in her hand, its headline bold and alarming. Mysterious death of business tycoon sparks new investigations. The press is circling like vultures, she said, setting the paper on the desk. They've already caught wind of your involvement. Let them speculate, I said, flipping through the journal again. We have bigger problems. Margaret's gaze fell on the journal. What did you find? I handed it to her, watching as her eyes scanned the pages. Her frown deepened with each line. Harmon Ellery, she murmured. If he was blackmailing Thomas, then he had motive, I finished. And he's not the only one. Eleanor knew something was wrong. Maybe she even knew about Ellery. Margaret's expression darkened. Do you think she's involved? I think she's hiding something, I said. But whether it's guilt or self-preservation, I can't tell yet. That afternoon, I drove into town to dig deeper into Harmon Ellery's history. The local archives were housed in an old brick building, its walls lined with rows of filing cabinets and faded photographs. After hours of searching, I found what I was looking for. A series of articles from the 1980s detailing a partnership between Thomas Davenport and Harmon Ellery. The two had been involved in a controversial land development project, one that had sparked public outcry over environmental concerns. According to the articles, Ellery had been the face of the operation, while Thomas had worked behind the scenes. The partnership dissolved after allegations of embezzlement surfaced, with Ellery taking the fall. He disappeared shortly after, his reputation in shambles. But one detail stood out, a photograph accompanying one of the articles. In it, Ellery stood beside Thomas, his face alight with confidence. Behind them loomed a partially constructed building, a project that had never been completed. The caption identified the site as Ravenwood, a name that felt heavy with significance. Returning to Brimstone Manor, I found Eleanor in the drawing room, staring out the window at the fog-shrouded grounds. She didn't turn as I entered, but her voice broke the silence. "You've been busy," she said. "So have you," I replied, stepping closer. "Tell me about Ravenwood." Her shoulders stiffened, and she finally turned to face me. "Where did you hear that name?" "Thomas's journal. The archives." "It's all starting to come together." I paused, studying her reaction. Harmon Ellery was blackmailing him, wasn't he? Ravenwood was a leverage. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You think you figured it out, don't you? But you're still missing pieces, Mr. Voss. Pieces you might not be ready to see." "Then show me," I said, my voice firm, "because if you don't, I will." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a resigned sigh, she turned back to the window. "Ravenwood wasn't just a project," she said softly. "It was a promise, one that Thomas broke, and one that Ellery never forgave him for." Her words hung heavy in the air, and I realized that the web I'd been unraveling was far more intricate than I'd imagined. Ravenwood wasn't just a piece of the puzzle. It was the center of it. And if I wanted to understand Thomas Davenport's death, I would have to face the shadows it cast. The road to Ravenwood was less a path and more a whisper of where civilization once dared to tread. Overgrown weeds clawed at the edges, and the trees formed an ominous tunnel that seemed to fold the world in on itself. I gripped the wheel tightly, the headlights of my car cutting through the fog like blades. The further I drove, the more I felt the weight of the case bearing down on me, its shadows pressing against the corners of my mind. Ravenwood wasn't just a forgotten ruin. It was a scar, a symbol of the Davenport legacy's dark underbelly. I parked the car and stepped out into the chilling air, the faint scent of damp earth mixing with the metallic tang of rust. The structure loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the overcast sky. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Broken beams hung like ribs from the ceiling, and graffiti marred the crumbling walls. My flashlight revealed more of the chaos. Shattered glass, discarded tools, and remnants of what appeared to be ledgers and maps scattered across the floor. The place had been abandoned in haste, as if those who had once worked here were fleeing something far more sinister than bankruptcy. I followed a faint trail of footprints in the dust, my mind racing with questions. Harmon Ellery's name had resurfaced too often to be a coincidence. Ravenwood had been his domain, a cornerstone of his partnership with Thomas Davenport. Whatever had transpired here, it was significant enough to destroy Ellery's life and haunt Thomas to his grave. At the end of the trail, I found a door hanging precariously on its hinges. Beyond it lay a small office, the only room that appeared untouched by the ravages of time. A desk stood at its center, papers and photographs meticulously arranged. The walls were adorned with maps and blueprints, all centered around the Ravenwood project. One photograph caught my eye. It was old, black and white, showing Thomas and Ellery standing side by side in front of a gleaming new construction site. Their expressions were triumphant, but there was tension in their body language, a stiffness that betrayed unease. Behind them loomed the skeleton of a building that had never been completed. Beside the photograph lay a notebook, its cover embossed with the initials HE. Inside were pages of neatly written entries, detailing transactions, deals, and names. My stomach tightened as I scanned the list, recognizing some of the individuals. Prominent businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officials. Ravenwood wasn't just a project. It had been a nexus for corruption, a hub for those willing to trade morality for power. A faint sound drew my attention. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. It was subtle at first, a soft shuffle, but it grew louder, accompanied by the creak of floorboards. Someone was here. I slipped the notebook into my pocket and extinguished my flashlight, stepping back into the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried. A figure emerged in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint glow of a distant light. I couldn't make out their face, but the glint of something metallic in their hand sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steady despite the tension coiled in my chest. The figure paused, their head tilting slightly as if considering me. Then, without a word, they turned and disappeared back into the corridor. I hesitated only a moment before following, my footsteps careful and silent. They led me deeper into the ruins, through a maze of crumbling walls and debris-strewn floors. At last, I found myself in a cavernous space that might once have been a warehouse. The figure stood at its center, facing away from me, their posture tense. "You shouldn't have come here," they said, their voice low and gravelly. "This isn't your fight." "I don't back down from a fight," I replied, my hand hovering near the holster at my side. "Who are you? And what do you know about Thomas Davenport?" They turned slowly, revealing a face etched with lines of anger and resolve. "You're chasing ghosts, detective," they said, "and you'll end up like him if you don't walk away." Before I could respond, they raised their arm, hurling something small and metallic in my direction. Instinct took over, and I ducked as a flashbang detonated, filling the room with blinding light and a deafening roar. When the chaos subsided, they were gone, leaving only the echo of their warning. I stumbled back to the office, my ears ringing and my vision blurred. The notebook in my pocket felt heavier than ever, its contents a damning testament to the darkness that had festered at Ravenwood. But the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this was only the surface. As I drove back to Brimstone Manor, the fog swallowed the road ahead, mirroring the uncertainty that clouded my thoughts. Thomas Davenport's death had been orchestrated, of that I was certain. But the players in this game were more numerous and more dangerous than I had anticipated. And as the lights of the manor came into view, one thing was clear. The truth was far from shattered. It was still waiting to be pieced together. The air was heavy with finality as I stood outside the decaying structure of Ravenwood. The building, long abandoned, seemed to exhale the secrets it had hoarded for decades. Its crumbling facade was cloaked in vines, and broken windows revealed a dark interior where the past had taken root. If Thomas Davenport's death had a truth buried somewhere, it was within these walls. The front door creaked open with a reluctant groan. Dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering through cracked panes, and the smell of mildew mingled with something sharper, a metallic tang that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across peeling wallpaper and splintered furniture. Each creak of the floorboard seemed amplified in the silence, as if the house were warning me to turn back. In the center of what once might have been a grand hall, I found it, a large, weathered table covered in scattered papers, faded photographs, and a map pinned down by rusted tools. The map was marked with red circles, each labeled with dates and cryptic notes. Ravenwood, it seemed, had been the center of operations for something far darker than a failed business venture. As I sifted through the documents, the story began to unfold. Ravenwood had been a front for illegal activities, smuggling, bribery, and even human trafficking. Thomas Davenport and Harmon Ellery had been equal partners in the beginning, but greed and ambition had driven a wedge between them. When the authorities closed in, Thomas had shifted the blame entirely onto Ellery, sacrificing his partner to preserve his fortune and reputation. But Ellery hadn't disappeared. He had spent years in the shadows, orchestrating his revenge. The payments Thomas made to him weren't just blackmail. They were a means to maintain Ellery's silence while he rebuilt his power. One of the photographs caught my attention. It showed a group of men standing in front of Ravenwood, Thomas Ellery, and others whose faces were blurred with time. In the corner of the frame stood Eleanor, much younger, her expression a mixture of defiance and unease. She wasn't just an outsider to the story. She had been part of it from the beginning. My mind raced as I pieced the fragments together. Eleanor's evasiveness, her cryptic warnings, they weren't just about protecting herself. She had known about Ravenwood, about Thomas and Ellery's crimes. She had been complicit, though to what extent I couldn't yet say. As I pocketed the photograph, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the floor above. My pulse quickened. Someone else was here. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. The footsteps paused, then resumed, heavier this time, descending the stairs. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by the hood of a rain-soaked jacket. The glint of a knife in their hand caught the light of my flashlight. I stepped back, my hand instinctively moving to the holster at my side. "Stay where you are," I ordered, my voice firm. "This doesn't have to end badly." The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You should have stayed out of this, Voss," they said, their voice gravelly and distorted. "You've dug too deep." I didn't wait for them to make the first move. My instincts kicked in, and I lunged sideways as the blade arced through the air where I'd been standing. The room erupted into chaos. The crash of overturned furniture, the clang of metal tools scattering across the floor. I managed to draw my weapon, leveling it at the assailant. "Drop it," I commanded, my breath coming fast. They hesitated, their gaze flicking to the door. For a moment, I thought they might comply, but then they threw something small and metallic at my feet. A flash of light and an ear-splitting bang filled the room, and when my vision cleared, they were gone. By the time I made it outside, the figure had vanished into the encroaching fog. My ears still rang from the explosion, and my hands shook as I pocketed my weapon. Whoever they were, they had come prepared. But why? What were they protecting? As I drove back to Brimstone Manor, my thoughts churned. The photograph in my pocket felt heavier than it should have. Eleanor's involvement in Ravenwood wasn't just tangential. She had been there, seen the corruption firsthand, and yet she had chosen to remain silent. Back at the manor, Eleanor was waiting for me in the drawing room. She stood by the fireplace, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. When she saw me, her expression tightened. "You went to Ravenwood," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did," I replied, "and I found enough to know that this isn't just about Thomas's death. It's about you, too." Her gaze didn't waver. "You think I'm responsible? I think you know more than you've admitted," I said, pulling the photograph from my pocket and holding it out to her. "You were there, Eleanor. You've been part of this from the beginning." She took the photograph, her hand trembling slightly. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the image. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "Thomas and Ellery, they built Ravenwood on lies, on pain. I tried to leave, but Thomas wouldn't let me. He said if I stayed quiet, he'd protect me. But he never did." Her confession hung in the air, heavy with years of suppressed guilt. "So you stayed quiet," I said, "even when Ellery came back, even when Thomas started paying him off." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought it would end with Thomas. I thought I could finally be free. But it hasn't ended," I said. "And now, you're as much a target as he was." Eleanor looked at me, her composure cracking. "What do I do, Mr. Voss? How do I make the stop?" I didn't have an answer. The shadows surrounding Ravenwood, Thomas, and Eleanor ran too deep, their roots tangled in decades of greed and betrayal. For now, all I could do was promise to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As I left the manor that night, the fog pressed close, shrouding the world in gray uncertainty. Ravenwood had given me answers, but also more questions. Eleanor's confession was a piece of the puzzle, but the edges didn't quite fit. Someone else was out there, pulling the strings, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The road stretched ahead of me, swallowed by the fog. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of footsteps echoed, then faded into silence. The game was far from over.